With the latest core report showing 6 of 10 foodborne illness outbreaks in 2024 having been linked to contaminated produce, and IFSAC's annual source report attributing nearly 70% of E. coli O157 illnesses to vegetable row crops, along with noteworthy numbers of Listeria monocytogenes and Salmonella illnesses also linked to produce. It's clear that there is still a lot to be done to ensure the safety of food crops. Welcome to Tag Talks Food Safety. I'm your host, Lisa Lupo, and today I'm talking with Senior Manager Food Safety Angela Ferelli Gruber about work that is being conducted to identify environmental factors that significantly contribute to the introduction, persistence, and spread of foodborne pathogens that could contaminate produce prior to harvest, and with an ultimate goal of that work being to develop solutions to make produce safer for consumers. Welcome, Angela.
Hi, Lisa. How are you today?
I am great and just always glad to have you here.
Thanks.
So, today we want to talk about the studies that FDA has conducted in California and Arizona in some key produce crop growing areas, such as that of leafy greens. So let's start with the risk assessment that was released in early March on produce in California. Can you provide a brief overview of that study?
I sure can. So that was a longitudinal study that started in 2020. So a conglomerate of a few different groups got together in California, including the Western Center for Food Safety at the University of California, Davis, the California Department of Agriculture, as well as different folks from the agricultural community. So they all got together and launched this study and collected samples between 2020 and 2025 of a variety of different agricultural inputs from surface water samples, soil samples, sediment of water samples, livestock feces, wildlife feces, and air samples as well. And they assess these samples for the prevalence of Shiga toxin producing E. coli, including E. coli O157. That is our pathogenic E. coli, specific pathogenic E. coli that some of us are researching on in produce safety. And they also looked at prevalence of Salmonella and Campylobacter. And so they have distributed some key findings from the Shiga toxin producing E. coli results of the study. The Salmonella and Campylobacter results of the study are still being analyzed. And then everything together will be published in at least one, probably multiple scientific articles. So look out for that. Right now, we have some key highlights from the Shiga toxin producing E. coli part of that study is that the researchers found 486 isolates of Shiga toxin producing E. coli, and that represents about 68 serotypes. So that's very interesting. In terms of the different types of pathogenic E. coli that they were able to find, they did find all 6 STEC stereotypes that are considered highly pathogenic to humans. So those are the big 6 that we see sometimes in foodborne outbreaks. That includes O157H7, O26H1, H11, O103H2, O111H8, O121H19, and O145H28. Interestingly, the specific STEC strain that was responsible for the recurring outbreaks between 2018 and 2020 was not recovered from this study, but other O157s were recovered. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Some of the results of note. So the overall prevalence of STEC seemed to be highest in wildlife and livestock feces samples compared to other sample types like water and water sediment and soil and air. Specifically, they found that samples, fecal samples from rangeland cattle and feral pigs, deer, birds, and coyotes were frequent sources of Shiga toxin producing E. coli. For livestock, they also sampled sheep and horses, and as well as cattle, but they found that cattle had the highest prevalence.
Okay.
A couple of interesting highlights related to some relationships were able to be kind of teased out with this work because this work utilized molecular methods, including whole genome sequencing. So we are starting to be able to see where some of these organisms kind of are linked in different sample types. So two stories related to that. They did find that STEC isolated from wildlife feces genetically matched strains from cattle feces. And then in some cases, some water and sediment samples had STEC strains that genetically matched feces. So we can see that there are some relationships in this agricultural environment. The key highlights didn't really mention a direction yet of where this relationship is coming from and going to, but it is important to note that that relationship is there. And then secondly, they did find that STEC prevalence in surface water and sediment samples collected at public sites that were close to cattle rangelands and wildlife zones was higher than at the public site samples that were collected where they didn't have very close wildlife zones or cattle rangelands. So that again provides some evidence of potential relationships between STEC prevalence in one area that might be related to STEC prevalence in an agricultural input like water.
Okay.
They also found through this study, because it was a longitudinal study, they sampled the same areas multiple times throughout the last 5 years. And they were able to pull in some of these samples shikatoxin producing E. coli from those same samples over time. So that tells us that STEC might be able to persist in some specific sources over time. So one study related to that is they were able to find in a publicly accessible ditch adjacent to a produce field in a vineyard and downhill from a cattle rangeland. They pulled STEC out of that ditch. It looks like a few times over a 3.5 year period. And then they assessed the mitochondrial DNA of the STEC pulled out of that sample, and it suggested that both potentially cattle and feral pigs might have contributed to STEC being in that sample. So both we're getting there, both a time aspect and also potentially a source. So I mentioned that throughout this study, they took poop samples of wildlife and of cattle. So not only did they take fresh poop samples, but they also took dried up poop samples, and they were able to recover viable shikatoxin producing E. coli from both dried up shriveled poo, older poo, and fresh poo. So I think this is relevant because sometimes I talk to farmers and they might think that using an aged manure might be safer. And
Right.
this study is showing, at least in some cases, if it is aged, we can still have a bacterial hazard. The last thing I'll say about what the key highlights in this California study is that they did sample in addition to feces and water and soil, they sampled air, and they didn't really find a substantial amount of STEC prevalence in the soil and the air in California, save one specific event where they did do some intense soil sampling at one ranch, and they did find that after a flooding event, they were able to pull STEC out of soil samples there. So that is another interesting finding that helps reinforce some food safety mantras that the produce safety folks have been saying for a while, that a flooding event can introduce hazards into your land that need to be managed. So while that is interesting, the bigger picture interesting piece of this is that we didn't find, or the researchers didn't find a large prevalence of STEC in soil or air in California.
Okay. So when you look at those studies in California and Arizona, and what do you see as kind of the primary similarities and differences in those?
Yeah, there's a couple, right? So in California, the viable STEC was isolated from less than 1% of passive air samples. So that suggests that air might not be a significant vector for movement of shikatoxin producing E. coli in this area. However, as I had just mentioned, air was a factor in the Arizona sampling study. And, why is that? You can think to yourself, well, we are starting to see that climatic differences and differences in the region are something to be taken account of when you are a farmer, and your management of your hazards might be different depending on where you're growing your crops, right? In both of these scenarios, we did see that STEC can end up in the water, but the factors contributing to that are different. Where in Arizona, we have some dry and arid climates, you might be looking to mitigate that by using wind buffers, right? In California, you might be looking at more vegetative buffer situations to protect your water source and conveyance from adjacent and nearby land use if you're finding that that is a hazard that you have to manage for. Another interesting difference that I did see, so, the California study found a good amount of STEC prevalence in wildlife, and the
Hmm.
Arizona study did not. They did not see that wildlife had a large STEC prevalence. So I thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah, yeah, that is. So, and given those kind of both areas, I guess, what other types of things should growers be aware of in and around their fields to kind of help control the safety of the produce?
Right. So I think kind of no matter where you are, it is coming to pass that it's important for you to be aware of your adjacent and nearby land uses, not only what is like physically bumping up to the fields that you grow your produce on, but what is also interacting and can potentially impact your water source and its conveyance from where the source is to where you're using it. So I would recommend that folks, kind of regardless of where they are in the states, to start making connections with their neighbors and collaboratively work together to figure out what sort of management strategies can help protect these agricultural inputs. Again, as I mentioned, these strategies might be different depending on where you are in the United States, depending on what your prevailing climate is, if you have prevailing winds, if you're not in a windy place, if you're in more of a humid place, your management strategies and your risks might be a little different. So research is kind of just starting to annotate what those specific profiles look like, and I'm really excited to see what the state of research is going to be in 10 years. Ideally we have regionally specific management strategies that are tailored to the different hazards that have been identified through research.
Okay. And if we kind of look beyond these studies, even and those types of contamination, what are some of the other things that growers can do to prevent other contaminations and to just help keep consumers safe when they eat those
Yeah,
products?
of course. Well, I would say that, what we see a lot of the times is we're forgetting to go back down to basics, right?
Okay.
It is super important to make sure that all of your workers have adequate facilities at the field level, that those facilities are not leaking, that they're well stocked, that everybody is trained to wash their hands specifically whenever they are about to go into the produce field. We see a lot of breakdowns in those fundamental areas that make it hard for the rest of your food safety program to work effectively. So make sure that those fundamental areas are taken care of. The other thing that I like to recommend to folks is to train up your workers so that they have a really advanced eye of risk assessment, right? Those are your folks who are boots on the ground, who are making sure that what they're picking is the safest, highest quality produce item. So I would recommend that you give them the tools to be able to, and this is part of the produce safety rule as well, right? They should be able to know what is okay to harvest and what should not be harvested. And they should feel comfortable to be able to speak up and say, there's a problem here. We might need to stop harvest. Those things are always important things to reiterate. I also see sometimes a lot of opportunities in terms of sanitation of tools and equipment. So making sure that your harvest bins, your harvesters, any sort of harvesting tools are cleaned and sanitized and ready to go when the day starts, because we don't want all of this good work that we took to grow this safe crop to now become a problem because we are using tools and equipment that don't have either the best, sanitary design or don't have a great sanitation schedule. So those are the things that I would keep in mind.
Okay. So that's a lot. There's a there's a lot that goes into keeping food safe, especially produce, I think. So how does the Atchison Group help produce the growers in these areas?
Oh, well, we can do a variety of different things for you depending on what your needs are. If you still need to be trained in the produce safety rule, I am a lead trainer and we can train you. If you're looking to have an assessment done of your growing areas and your pack house to see where opportunities might lie, either from a best practices perspective or from a regulatory mind perspective, we are not regulators, but while we're well versed in the rule, we can give you an eagle eye into where some sort of areas of opportunity for you might lay. We also have experts in sanitary design, and I do know that sometimes pack houses have some challenges in some of the equipment from a sanitary design perspective. And, sometimes it's a challenge to know, well, how do we manage this equipment? How do we know how clean is clean? What sort of verification can we use? And we can help you in that area as well. So
Okay.
call us anytime.
Yeah, great. So I really want to thank you for all your insights, Angela. There's so much involved in this, and you've made it very interesting. I learned a lot from this as well, and so I hope our audience has too. But while produce does continue to be a top reason for recalls, it really does seem that there's a lot going on to try to mitigate that.
Mm.
So, given all that you discussed, what would you see as the key takeaways, the thoughts that you'd really want our audience to remember from this discussion?
Okay, so I would say the key take homes here are number one, don't forget your basics of on farm food safety, making sure that everybody's showing up every day ready for success. The tools are cleaned, everybody's trained, and we have facilities to be able to service folks. And then I would say for the farm managers as well, now is the time to get to know your neighbors and build a rapport with them, especially if you've identified that there might be some activities close to you that can impact your growing areas, right? And I'm thinking about large concentrated animal feeding operations. If you have any of that that's close to your field or close to your water source or conveyance, now's the time to knock on the neighbor's door, build a rapport with them, and see if you can collaboratively build some strategies together to make sure that you can provide, the highest quality, safest product that you can.
Okay. That part of it sounds a little easier. Maybe if you're a friendly person knocking on the door, but very important, like you said, it's just all part of trying to make things safe. So
Mm.
I want to thank you again, Angela, and I do want to thank our audience for listening in. And we hope that you have learned a bit about what the industry is doing to keep produce safe. We really appreciate your joining us, and as always, to stay informed on all things food safety and ensure you don't miss any episodes, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to Tag Talks Food Safety on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Thank you again.
Thank you.